Morning, everybody. How are we doing on this Easter Sunday? It's fairly pleasant looking day. I think we're going to be in the 50s today. It's weird weather we've been having here in Minnesota. First, want to address the political episode I did last time, that rant I had. Most of the feedback I got was pretty positive, to be honest. I think a lot of that feedback came from people who lived outside the United States of America. New Zealand chimed in, South Africa chimed in, some Europeans chimed in. I mean, it's easier for them to see the forest because they're not stuck inside the trees. It is a real compromised politic here in this country. And we're not going to talk politics this episode, but I appreciate all the comments, and those of you who don't agree with my viewpoints, I mean, you're entitled to what you believe. Hope you think through it carefully and listen to what I said, because I'm not coming from a place of polarity. I'm coming from a place of rather neutrality, objective human scope, not some nationalistic agenda. And if you don't understand that money rules the day and all things always, you're kind of missing every lesson that history's probably ever taught us. But anyway, I'm glad people enjoyed that episode that did. And there were some offended and indignant, I suppose. But I think I lost a couple subscribers, but I think I gained more than I lost. So be it. Today, I'm going to discuss what, in my opinion, are the 5 most important jazz figures from the classic era of jazz. And while this is obviously an objective list and it's prone to changes over the course of time, I've kind of had this top four established as my Mount Rushmore of jazz legends and greats for numerous reasons. A, innovation, and B, imitation. Those two things alone, I think, set these 4 guys really apart. And the number 5 character doesn't have that legacy. His legacy is much different. And we're just going to jump right into it. My number 5 guy is Miles Davis. And Miles Davis today is probably considered the most important figure in jazz. He's certainly the one with the luminosity and the legacy that's really connecting with today's record-buying audience. There's numerous reasons for that. In particular, his association with the Columbia record label, which is still a label in existence today. Still one of the most powerful record labels in the history of the music industry, and his signing with Columbia really elevated his stance. He made a lot of crossover records that were broad in their appeal and sold really well. He was the master at trimming great musicians from other people's bands, and was often given great credit as a band leader, but he was not a great band leader. Most people hated working for the guy. He was a good check. He was a good paycheck. But he was a very difficult taskmaster and an ornery guy, to say the least. But he wasn't this great band leader who found talent. He didn't discover Herbie Hancock and Ron Carter and, go on down that list. He picked those guys from other bands and projects that were developing. He robbed a lot of jazz messenger talent over the years from Art Blakey. And those guys often don't have a lot negative to say because they recognize Miles' legacy, and you kind of just, you whitewash over some of the negative, but between the cracks you see a lot of that. So he's not the band leader that people think he was, and he's most definitely not the innovator or the most imitated player. And if you read the context of jazz at that time, it's clear he's not seen as one of the great players that people imitate. It's clear he was not seen as one of the great innovators. He took a lot of other people's innovations and popularized them. And whether we're talking about the birth of the cool, which is really Conrad and Mulligan and other players, and Gil Evans that Miles was a part of, whose name got attached to it later as kind of the leader once his fame had kind of ascended at Columbia. Capitol kind of reissues that stuff and tries to capitalize on Miles' up-and-coming legacy, but those were never Miles Davis sessions, birth of the cool. Bebop, he was a peripheral player at best, who Dizzy and Parker and others were trying to educate and show the way, but Miles was never a bebop trumpet player. Hard bop, he certainly was part of a great quintet with Coltrane, Garland, Philly Joe, and Paul Chambers, which was imitating Clifford Brown, Max Roach quintet. I mean, that was the innovation in hard bop. And then, of course, the Jazz Messengers with Horace Silver, and the Jazz Messengers, of course, Art Blakey. Those bands and groups were the ones that really spawned and drove. But it was certainly Blakey and Silver and Clifford Brown, Max Roach, that were driving the innovations of hard bop. And Miles was a rather unknown figure who put together this great quintet with the young and upcoming John Coltrane, who Lockheed heard from Columbia, signed to Columbia, and those last few records at Prestige, his early work at Columbia, is seminal hard bop work, but he's not the innovator of that sound whatsoever. Going into the modal thing, Miles gets a lot of credit for modal innovation, but he wasn't the innovator there. It was clearly George Russell's innovation, who Bill Evans was playing with, and Miles hires Bill Evans away to help him learn and play and perform the modal stuff, and Evans didn't have much patience to be working with Miles Davis. Victor Feldman comes into camp, and he couldn't stand working with Miles Davis, didn't want to be part of the band. There's an unwritten subtext at the time that speaks volumes over what the correctional vision of modern jazz writers seem to think. But if you read liner notes from the day, you never read someone saying, this trumpet player was great and really comes from the Miles Davis school and was trying to imitate Miles. I mean, he's just not that guy. He was a guy who popularized a lot of other things, which makes him very important. And his records sold well, including a lot of his Columbia records, like Sketches of Spain, Kind of Blue, sold 1 million copies, which for jazz was unheard of by that time. By 59-60, jazz had been very much marginalized. And it was a few records, Louis Armstrong's Hello Dolly, Dave Brubeck's Take Time Out, Take 5. Those records sold really well. The Bossa Nova in 62 sold really well. But jazz was peripheral, and album sales were not what they once were. And Miles did manage in that time frame to put out records that sold well. And then going into the avant-garde elements of free jazz, Miles certainly wasn't an innovator in that camp in any way. And though they delve into that somewhat with the second great quintet, with Shorter and Hancock and Tony Williams and Ron Carter, that's really Wayne Shorter's compositions and those young kids who are part of the current stream, that Miles Davis is almost holding on by his coattails saying, oh my God, kids, slow down. And so Miles doesn't really just receive any of the credit there. And going into the electronic fusion era, Miles again was not an innovator. He popularized that stuff somewhat with Bitches Brew and In a Silent Way and On the Corner, Jack Johnson. But again, there was people who came before him who were making that crossover, and black music in general was crossing over into rhythm and blues, and the popularity of these new emerging funk bands like Earth, Wind and Fire and Fatback and Ohio Players, and I mean the entire thing of black music was getting towards that more funky, more danceable. I mean, Miles, I've said before, saw Sly Stone at Monterey or one of the great festivals of 68, 69, and Miles felt intimidated and insecure because the kids were dancing to Stand, dance to the music, thank you for letting me be myself. I mean, those early Sly Stone singles are outstanding. And that band that Sly put together with Larry Graham and the female members and the white members on the horns, and just a real mixed example of proto-funk. And of course, James Brown's innovations, which are stemming directly from what Louis Jordan and the Jump Blues was doing earlier on in the 40s. I mean, there was a whole tide of black music turning towards rhythm and blues and funk. And Miles Davis simply wanted to be popular and be cool again. He didn't want to make the records of his youth or his childhood or of his own legacy. He wanted to keep trying to be on the cutting edge, but that always meant looking around him and going, who's out there that I can imitate? What can I do that would make me feel? And he always hired the best talent. Didn't discover it, but he just hired it. And good for him. I mean, Miles' legacy is an important legacy. He's number 5 on this list for a reason, but he's certainly not the visionary, and he's not the guy that the critics today and the revisionists have made history out to be. I mean, he's not seen at that time by any way as one of the great new voices that's going to transform jazz. And I think many people from that time frame, if they knew 70 years down the road Miles Davis was going to be seen as the luminary above all other jazz players, most of them would be rolling in their grave and be shocked back to life. I mean, it's not what anybody would have predicted. There's many voices that were coming along that people were assuming were going to be that voice, that messiah for the music. And obviously Miles' importance is relevant. He did do a lot for popularizing the music and bringing a white audience to jazz with the crossover to Gil Evans records and the fusion records, and I mean adding the rock elements to the jazz funk elements in those 70s records. That brings a lot of people, that's what jazz is. Think of those records with John McLaughlin and that whole era of music with Chick Corea as being what jazz is. And again, that's very much a hybrid that comes very much at the end of Halley's Comet. This was the dying embers of what was once a powerful movement. So Miles is firmly entrenched at number 5 on my list, and he will never ascend above the next 4, in my definition. And I have the record collection, the jazz history, all the album reviews, all the liner notes that confirm that bias. It's not just me going, oh, I think this and that's why I feel that way. It's just the consensus from thousands and thousands of liner notes I've read and album reviews I've read and the critics of the time. It's pretty clear. Number 4 on my list is the great and very imitated Thelonious Monk. Monk comes along, late 40s, records some sides for Blue Note, doesn't garner much attention, goes to Prestige, records some fine sides there, including with some with Sonny Rollins, but again, doesn't really garner much attention. The critics aren't really loving the guy. He's not really seen as an important figure. He was seen kind of as abstract and Picasso-like and almost too off the beaten path to ever become popular. And once again, he ends up at Columbia Records by 1959-60, and that really solidifies his legacy and his popularity, although it was really his signing to Riverside in 55 by Orrin Keepnews and Bill Grauer that really kind of elevate Monk's reputation among the critics anyway. The critics realized that with Brilliant Corners and some of the records he was making at that time, that this was a new innovation. This was a minimal, jagged form of jazz that left out spaces and had pockets and had open room, and it was the entire idea of dissonance and spatial open areas and weird jigsaw puzzle-like composition, yet all was resolved in melody and groove at some point. It always comes back to a pocket that gives you satisfaction. But Monk's style, his impact on jazz around him, is pretty unparalleled. Many players kind of followed into that school, imitating. And there were some contemporaries like Bud Powell who were kind of in that same camp to begin with. A lot of New York players that were kind of in that same vein. But Monk's innovations are felt across music. And yeah, I think you can say some modern classical has some of that same dissonance and weird compositional value. But Monk's innovations, I think, really hit the hipster scene and the white psychedelic pop rock scene. And I think there's entire genres of pop and rock that are kind of considered alternative with some of their abstractness and some of their dissonance and some of their weird approach to melody and sound and rhythm and time. And clearly, Thelonious Monk is one of the great innovators and great sounds of the music. I've said this many times, but Monk at his best can sound like a cat walking across a piano. Like it's so interesting, the places he drops notes and the chords that he'll drop and the dissonance he'll create by putting a 1, 2, 3, 5 chord together and then a 1, 3, 4 together, and he doesn't need to have the basic minors and major chords. There's Monk chords that exist that are just out of his own head. And the interesting character that he was, how he would get up and start dancing when his soloists were playing, and how many of his soloists had a hard time following his compositions. I mean, I think Johnny Griffin was one of the guys that really grafted onto Monk's sound and got it. But, I mean, there was a lot of times where the players behind him were like, oh, shit, where did we just end up? Because Monk had his own steam that fueled his engine. It was always so abstract and so interesting and oft imitated, but never really matched. And his innovations, I think, are being felt in music still today. And I think even much of the avant-garde and the free jazz movement that happens in the 60s into the 70s into modern jazz today, Monk is still one of the most important factors and one of the most important composers. And when you see a jazz combo play, the chances of throwing a Monk tune or 2 or 3 into that set are almost as high as they are of hearing Ellington stuff. And Ellington's songbook, of course, is ubiquitous and is the language of the jazz songbook on so many levels. Ellington's songs are just universal. But Monk's impact is absolutely incredible, and he's number 4 on my list. And like I said, he's on the Mount Rushmore of jazz immortality. And this guy is a real eccentric personality that was rivaled by his eccentric playing. And his impact and his innovation are really top of the mark. Super valuable player, super interesting to get to know his work. And you can reevaluate his early work at Prestige and Blue Note from the late 40s, early 50s, and even hear how developed what Monk's signature sound was. And again, not to slight Miles, but Miles' sound took a long time to develop before he became the traditional Miles Davis that we know of. I mean, you listen to Miles' bebop recordings late 40s, is playing in the early 50s. He's searching for an identity and a sound. His early Blue Note recordings are quite inconsequential. Not a great player, not a guy who had developed his sound and tonality. And again, even his minimal approach was often impacted by guys like Thelonious Monk and, of course, the great Ahmad Jamal out of Chicago, who Miles openly admits he heard Ahmad Jamal's open spaces and open minimalism and imitated that and kind of adapted the mute, which again, Sweets Edison really brought to fame. And again, Miles gets credit for being the mute player, but Miles' innovations really are few and far between. And he's really a great imitator who popularized a lot of things. But again, it's not, again, it's slighting Miles. He's number 5 on my list. It's just I think he's so idolized today by so many so incorrectly. And I think many from that time frame would be really appalled by Miles' ascension into the hierarchy of the jazz canon. Number 3 on my list, and again, this list is a little bit tough to really nail down, but number 3 is going to be Louis Armstrong. And I'm a huge Armstrong guy. His body of work is immense. And I think a lot of people minimize Louis to as what a wonderful world. And I mean, it's a great song. Let's not take anything away from that song. But there's so much more to Louis Armstrong than What a Wonderful World and the gravelly voice of an old man who wants you to sit on his knee while he tells you a story. Louis Armstrong was the great innovator in jazz. And of course, Buddy Bolden's legend exists. Nothing exists that we know of recorded. And Bolden seems to be the progenitor of what Armstrong and King Oliver and those guys were doing in Freddie Keppard in New Orleans. But Louis Armstrong states the vocabulary and records and documents what jazz was going to become and be. And how Louis Armstrong played, how he reinvents rhythm, how he's willing to play behind the beat and then kind of jump in front of it. And then he takes all those innovations that he brought to the horn and brings that all to his voice and singing. And most singers who recognize the history and lineage of great singing and vocalists will recognize the impact that Armstrong had on singing of the 20th century. Before Armstrong, you sang in a kind of a classical way with very little room for your own interpretation and no room for improvisation, no room to personalize the content and make it yours. You had to kind of inflect and reflect the original composer's ideologies. And you didn't change melody lines, you didn't change rhythms, and you didn't sing behind the beat to bring accents. You didn't inflect cheek or sardonic sarcasm into a lyric. It was always written as on the page and performed that way. and was very kind of professional. Armstrong comes along and throws all that on its head. He says, nah, I can take your song and make it mine, and watch me do it by just changing a few words, changing a few inflections, changing the rhythms, the patterns, the melodies. I'm going to alternate some melodies that you wouldn't think of even having done. But Armstrong's innovations were so impactful and immediate and omnipresent. He could do it on the spot at any time. Didn't matter the content, didn't matter the song, didn't matter the performance, the audience. Armstrong was bubbling with innovation, bubbling with ideas, bubbling with excitement and jubilation, and it pours out of his horn, it pours out of his voice, it pours out of the sweat pours on his brow that he was constantly wiping all that energy that he was exposing and expelling out of him because he was such a brilliant man and performer. Armstrong to me is the greatest American to ever have lived. I've called him the Great Forgiveness for a decade. He's the arm that extends from the black community to white America and says, you know what, let's move forward. Let's forget some of this ugly history. I'm going to come into your homes on 78 RPM players, and you're going to play my songs. You're going to love it. And then when you hear stuff like the West End Blues, which anybody who knows any bit of jazz history, Armstrong's playing on that, especially in that open salvo. It's machine gun fire unlike ever heard before. The equivalent of hearing an M16 firing back in the days of cannon fire. 6, 7, 8, reload. I mean, that slow, methodical approach to gunfire, single shot rifles and cannons. Armstrong comes along and says, and just sprays sound and note and rhythm and pulse. And it's such an amazing, immaculate innovation that feels almost immediate. Like it doesn't feel like it was even planned. It's just he's just putting so much energy and compulsion and passion and joy and ebullience into that performance that it just blows out of the speaker. And one of the other great things about Armstrong is his light. He's a player filled with light and joy of life. And even as his health deteriorated in his older age and as his lips would bleed and the calluses would burst, he still would play defiantly, bleeding on stage. He was such an absolute atomic performer. And he ends up being an important civil rights figure as well. He ends up taking a stance and saying some things during the 60s when some accuse him of being Uncle Tom. But he really did take some difficult political stances. He smoked reefer every day of his life, regardless of what any of his advisors might have told him, Joe Glazer and company. He obviously at times ended up working for the mob and was willing to just kind of cut those ties and go his own way. Armstrong was a resilient, incredible personality that the lifelike performance, the above average normal existence of this man elevates his entire art form to that next level. And none of the guys that come on this list exists without what Armstrong did. He's a huge figure in American history and civil rights movement and black culture. He should have a library and a school named after him in every state. He's absolutely one of the most beautiful human beings to ever walk this planet. And the joy and forgiveness and his attitude towards white America was one of very much saying, you know what? If I don't make it in white America, I'm not going to be able to make it. I need to have the white Americans love what I do. And he used Joe Glazer for years as his manager to help him cross those lines and to help him. And I've said this before, I'm going to say it one more time, and I'll probably say it again to be honest, but we talk about Jackie Robinson and breaking the color barrier in baseball in 1947, and it's very important what Jackie Robinson did, and he still faced a lot of obstruction and a lot of obscenity and a lot of hate hurled towards him as he played for those Brooklyn Dodgers, but Armstrong beats Jackie Robinson by 2 decades. 20 years earlier, Armstrong was kind of crossing those color lines and playing with Jack Teagard and white band members and forcing that assimilation that he felt as essential to the healing of not just his people, but of the nation. And you got to remember that 1920s, 1930s were not that far removed from the Civil War. The era of Reconstruction and Jim Crow were very much alive as Armstrong was bridging that gap. And so for all the innovation and all the powerful message of the Civil Rights era in the 50s and 60s, which jazz was at the forefront of, Armstrong's coming at a much more difficult time, elevating and changing the status of what was a very broken, fractured nation. So there's no denying Armstrong's impact on jazz and how many people imitated his playing, his virtuosity, his style. I mean, Clifford Brown, Sweets Edison, Roy Eldridge, Dizzy Gillespie. The entire legacy of trumpet really is rooted in what Louis Armstrong brought to the trumpet. So his innovation, his personality, his impact on jazz, again, his popularity, there's no question Armstrong's name rings loud and true above the halls of the Jazz Hall of Fame. Armstrong belongs on the Mount Rushmore once again. And for any people out of the country who don't know what Mount Rushmore is, it's a monument in South Dakota to the 4 great American presidents of sometimes this Reconstruction Jim Crow era, to be honest. And some of those guys were slave owners and not the best human beings to begin with themselves. Washington, Jefferson, I mean, it's what an ugly legacy we live under. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt wasn't a human rights ambassador by any stretch of the imagination either. So it's, and then of course Lincoln is a very mixed bag. But we're not going to talk American history right now, aside from the context that it brings to jazz. So number 2 on my list. So Miles is 5, 4 was Monk, 3 was Armstrong. Number 2 is Charlie Parker. And Parker is such a mixed bag. Obviously, the heroin legacy is strong with him. The alcohol that he used to medicate himself when he couldn't get heroin, his struggles with drugs are very synonymous with the legacy of Bird. And it's hard to sometimes separate that story from the rest of his narrative because it does so dominate a lot of the headlines. The borrowing his friends' instruments and then pawning them off to get junk, and the irregularity of his performances and his recording sessions, and not knowing what condition the man was going to show up at, and him going out with Dizzy Gillespie to the West Coast on the train, and Parker walking away in the middle of the desert, and them having to go chase him down and bring him back to the train, holding the train up. I mean, the stories of Parker's unreliability do tinge his legacy on some level, but it's part of the Parker story and part and parcel of how we have to evaluate the man. So to not address it would be kind of frivolous and ridiculous. But Parker's innovations, again, are immeasurable. And every player after Charlie Parker learned to play something like Charlie Parker. And of course, bebop wasn't something he sat there and mapped out. Bebop was something he did from hours of playing, wearing that mask of protection called playing that horn. And those steps, those innovations kind of just evolved. And he starts professing that stuff at late night jam sessions and recognizing that just because I'm playing Body and Soul or just because I'm playing Oklahoma's Cherokee, I don't need to state the melody and play with the chords and limit myself to the notes within those chords and play my solo. I can play every note within that scale and almost ignore the melody that the song once dominated with. And he doesn't often even state those melodic themes. He'll just play notes within those chords and within those scales and allow himself to have all these snakes and ladders to jump up and down to endlessly play ideas. And I think sometimes his innovations were linked too much to the drug legacy. I think a lot of it comes more from his soul speaking and the condition of being black in America. And I think some of the drugs were also a result of that struggle, that stress of being under tyranny and oppression and having to live in such a difficult place as a black American. So the drugs, I think, were medication as much as they were a stimulant for innovation. The innovation came from the hours of playing and the endless jam sessions and the boredom of playing in kind of rigid swing orchestras, playing with the Jay McShanns and playing with the other groups that he played with over the years. He was chomping at the bit to do more. And they would often have these all-night jam sessions after they played, and just they would eschew all what was done in the early part of the evening and just break boundaries and just play and jam and make sound and make noise. And in some ways, he's a bit of a Jimi Hendrix of the jazz world, where he just brings things to the instrument that no one really had thought of as even being done. And it's kind of an endless, breathtaking review of what the potentials of music and scale and melody can all provide. And he really dives into so much of music theory without ever being a theoretician. without ever being a mathematician. It was never something he was too concerned about. It was always far more about, I'm just going to play, and whatever comes out, comes out. And it took Dizzy Gillespie to come along, who was a mathematician, who was a theoretician, to look at what Parker was doing and going, oh shit, son, that's some badass stuff with my little soul patch. I'm going to take what you're doing and codify that so that I can play it, so I can teach other people to play it. And all the other greats, I mean, Monk was kind of part of the scene, Howard McGee was part of the scene. The bebop scene really took a lot of the great young black talent, and Fats Navarro, and these guys were all exploring and diving into this new sound. Max Roach, Bud Powell, and what Parker brought to the alto saxophone, it transcended and transposed into every instrument in the jazz groups, the jazz orchestras. And it transposes better to some horns and some instruments than others. I mean, doing it on the trombone was challenging, but J.J. Johnson did it. Doing it on the piano was difficult, but Bud Powell did it. Doing it on the drums might not have been easy, but guys like Max Roach and Kenny Clark did it. I mean, doing it on the organ was very difficult, but Jimmy Smith did it. It just happens across every envelope of the music. Parker's innovations stream through. And you hear everybody, and it was one of the most common things to read in liner notes of the 50s and going into the 60s. He plays a lot like Parker. He borrows from Parker's sound. He borrows from Parker's innovations. And again, Parker is one of the most imitated players in the jazz canon. And sadly, his recorded legacy doesn't live up to that of Monk's or Miles. It's just, there's some great stuff recorded from Norman Granz. But it's not really his bebop stuff. His stuff from the 40s, there's some stuff on Dial, some stuff on Savoy, some stuff on a few other labels from that era. But those recordings don't really quite capture sonically and the brilliance of his playing. And you actually hear it more on things like Parker with Strings on Verve, how brilliant a player he was and how beautiful his tone was. But his health really deteriorates rapidly, and he dies way too young in 55. And what a loss. And we lost Clifford Brown right around the same time, who is probably number 6 or 7 on this list. Clifford Brown was, I mean, just a real incredible innovation and a revealer of what the next steps in jazz could have possibly been. And I think Clifford Brown was the guy that everybody thought was going to be the next savior, messiah of jazz, until his untimely death in that car accident in, was it 56? I think he died early in 56. I mean, it was a tough time for jazz. A lot of greats were passing away on us. We lost Lester and Billy back in like, a couple years later, and I mean, we lost a lot of real great talent in a real short period of time there. But without question, Parker's innovations are universal and felt across the jazz universe. And that leads us to number 1. And if you don't know who number 1 is by this point, you probably not watched this channel very much, and you probably haven't listened to much jazz. Because anytime you go see jazz, anytime you hear jazz, the chances of you hearing this man's compositions are pretty darn likely. The great Duke Ellington. Ellington's body of work as a composer and arranger, along with Billy Strayhorn and that great orchestra and the talent that plays with Ellington. I mean, I got to give it a nod and a shout out to Count Basie as well, because Basie was also one of the great band leaders and great innovators of swing and drive and groove. And I think a lot of Basie's minimalism, and we're a progenitor of funk and jump blues and R&B, but Basie doesn't quite have the ascendancy and the legacy of Ellington. Basie's records you can get for pretty cheap, which is ridiculous, but you can. Ellington's records are starting to fetch good money, some titles more so than others. And again, they sold pretty well. It's Columbia stuff, which is really hard to get a grasp of, because a lot of it's re-recorded stuff from the 30s and 40s. Sometimes it's stuff that they had in the vaults that they're repackaging on LP. And there's also new material being recorded in the 40s and 50s, into the 60s and 70s. Ellington's body of work is immense. From the sacred concerts of the late 70s to the jungle music he was making in the late 20s, Ellington is jazz in so many ways. And he didn't like the word jazz with its derogatory connotations and its racial inflection. He thought that the music he made was Ellington's music, which in all cases it is. And his music across all genres and all subdivisions of the music, his music stays omnipresent. The great beboppers, the great modal players, the great players that go into the free. I mean, you still do Ellington stuff. And when you go see a jazz group today, I have jazz groups play here all the time, duos and trios. Ellington is so much of the songbook still. Satin Doll, I don't get around much anymore. It's just omnipresent how many of his songs are just so part of what jazz players still perform. His melody, his counter melodies, his arrangements, his production sense, his orchestra, the loose kind of control that he had over his men. It wasn't a rigid Benny Goodman kind of style of management. It was much more a Wild West posse assemblage of incredible talent that he often had a tough time managing because he wasn't a domineering personality. He was a rather elusive, hard to nail down character. Very debonair, very suave, very stylized, but also one that was clever at manipulation and setting people's emotional states to the place to get their best performances, often knowing how to put band members who were going to be soloing on a song together to make them even mad at each other so they would both perform with great fire. I mean, his legacy, his sound, and as a player, listen to Ellington with Coltrane and see how elegant and refined and beautiful. And a lot of people love Miles Davis's work with Gil Evans. It's nothing compared to the body of work that Ellington did. And Ellington's able to take composition and always make it swing and always make it have the blues and the black church in the background, so it always has resolution and resolve. It doesn't have those bright, tinny parts that Gil Evans compositions often have. There's always a swing. And the brilliant way he does instrumentation counter to intuition. You would sometimes want to have your clarinets play up here and your oboes play here and your French horns play here, but he would have the French horns playing at the high of their register and the clarinets playing at the bottom of their register, and creating sounds and tones with instruments counter to where you would normally have them placed. The way he would chart his trombone sections and his saxophone sections and his trumpet sections, and the talent that came through that group. I mean, it's a who's who. If you take the Ellington and Basie groups and took that membership over the course of years and then ask who the 100 greatest jazz musicians of all time, 40, 50 of them are going to be members of the Ellington Basie bands. It's just an incredible proving ground and university for up-and-coming jazz talent. And of course, other guys came along and had great bands: Dizzy Gillespie, Billy Eckstine, Lionel Hampton. They were all great universities, the Bart Blakey Jazz Messengers. These were all great universities that were proving grounds for young talent in jazz. But Basie and Ellington's groups were really the forebearer of all that. And Ellington's legacy as a composer, as an arranger, as a band leader, as a talent scout, as a brilliant voice in not just jazz history, but music history. And he's considered the greatest American composer of all time. And I don't think that there's even a number two that's close. Ellington's body of work is so unmatched. And I think that the great composers of the classical tradition, your Mozarts, your Beethovens, your Bachs, these guys, if they could hear what Duke Ellington did in the 20th century, would come back to life and be like, hallelujah. Man, I never thought of any of that. Wow, that's brilliant. Wow, how do you make that shit swing so hard? It's really an incredible testament to the brilliance. I mean, Strayhorn does deserve a lot of credit. Strayhorn was a young, dear friend of Ellington's that helped him co-compose and co-arrange later into Ellington's career, 50s and 60s. And Strayhorn's a big part in Strayhorn's death. Wrecked Ellington for a long time, as well as his mother's death. He was really a mother's boy, and when his mom passed, he really hit a hard time emotionally because she was such a support and a believer of young Duke Ellington's career. But Ellington deserves the number one place on this list, and I don't think it's even debatable. And so that's my 5 greatest, most important jazz musicians of the classic jazz era. Miles Davis at number 5, legacy in tow. Thelonious Monk at number 4, innovation and imitation followed him every step of the way. Number 3 is the great Louis Armstrong, who, again, the personality and the innovation and the virtuosity is just unrivaled. Parker, again, who reinvents so much of melody and the framework of how jazz was looked at and done and composed without it being a rigid, thought-out, sat down and think of how we're going to innovate and change the music. He just did it. And great innovation usually doesn't take a thought process. It's a performance and a rehearsal and a practice and a playing endlessly that made a new idea slip out. And then you start diving down that avenue, all of a sudden you have this new thing that everybody else wants to codify and imitate. And then, of course, past Parker, number 1 is the great Duke Ellington. And I don't think you could make a better top 5 list. There's other very important players, and jazz's legacy is littered with incredible talent and incredible voices and incredible players. But I think especially those top 4, all 4 of them brought innovation in spades, and all 4 of them have been imitated in spades, and all 4 of them have been copied and played and still played by groups today. I mean, Monk's recordings are everywhere. People still do Ellington stuff all the time. Everyone still wants to play like Armstrong if they can. Parker is still a huge part of all modern jazz. So the impact all 4 of them had, you can say as each one of them came along, jazz was never the same after that. And that's what makes those 4 the Mount Rushmore guys. After Armstrong, jazz was never the same. After Ellington, jazz was never the same. After Parker, jazz was never the same. And after Monk, jazz was never the same. And you could say that probably about Ornette Coleman as well. Coleman really has a real impact. He blows John Coltrane's mind, and Coltrane changes his career path because of what Ornette Coleman brought to the table. But I don't think Ornette Coleman's legacy reaches the heights of popularity. And I mean, a lot of jazz collectors today love Ornette Coleman's work, but it was a much more difficult music that a lot of common folk will never approach. And that's not to say he doesn't have some very beautiful compositions, because he does. So he's definitely in my top 10 Ornette Coleman in terms of innovation. But the 4 I've named, plus Miles Davis' popularity and legacy, are my 5 most important jazz figures of all time. Hope you all enjoyed that. Please support the channel. If you're ever up in the area, please stop by the coffee shop. If you want to support this channel or support the coffee shop, please donate money to the Patreon page or to my PayPal, which is on the page, or through Super Thanks on YouTube itself. All that stuff's very much appreciated. We are struggling to survive. It's been a slow time of season. The wife's departure 6 months ago is still causing ripple effects in my finances. And we're surviving, but we're certainly not living like kings. Nobody's asked me to live like kings. I get to do what I love for a living, so that's a blessing, and I'm a lucky man, and I love what I do. But it's still, money's a stressful thing in the world today, and the cost of inflation, everything's going up, and I mean, utilities are going up, and I need the revenue. So if you want to help support the channel, it's always appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate everyone who commented on the last few episodes. And again, that political stuff, you don't have to watch if you don't like it. I mean, but the negativity isn't necessarily what we're trying to create. We're trying to create a new bridge to a better world. One that embraces all of humanity, not just my little isolated pocket of individuality. So y'all be safe. Y'all have a great day. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.